The neon signs of New Taipei Station flickered against the perpetual twilight of the colony world's atmospheric shield. George wiped grease from his calloused hands, the kind of stains that never quite washed out after 15 years of keeping century-old haulers running. His small repair shop sat wedged between a noodle vendor and a parts dealer, the perfect spot to catch desperate captains whose ships broke down mid-route. Closing up, George muttered to himself, pulling down the magnetic shutters. That's when he heard it, a soft, hesitant voice barely audible over the hum of passing hover transports. "Excuse me, do you have any expired sandwiches?" George turned. Standing in the shadows was a girl, no more than 19, with wolf-like ears protruding from matted silver hair. Her tail hung low, and her clothing, layers of mismatched fabric, had seen better decades. But it was her eyes that caught him, amber, bright, and desperately trying to maintain dignity despite obvious hunger. The lichen refugees. George had heard about them. Their homeworld, Fenris Prime, had been glassed by the Crethon Empire 6 months ago. The survivors scattered across the galaxy like seeds in a storm. "Expired sandwiches?" George repeated, his gruff voice softening despite himself. The girl's ears flattened slightly. "I don't need fresh ones. Just whatever you'd throw out anyway. I can pay." She held out her palm, revealing 3 small credit chips worth maybe half a meal. George felt something twist in his chest. The galaxy was full of species, elegant Avari with their crystal wings, the silicon-based Grenth who lived for millennia, the telepathic Mindari who could calculate hyperspace, jumps mentally. They all looked at humans as primitive, barely civilized apes who'd stumbled into space travel through sheer stubbornness. But this girl, this refugee from a destroyed world, was asking him for garbage. "Come inside," George said, raising the shutter again. Laura hesitated, her instincts warring with her desperation, but hunger won. She followed him into the cluttered shop, past shelves of salvaged parts and half-repaired machinery. George didn't have expired sandwiches. He had leftover dumplings from lunch, 2 protein bars, and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm. He set them all on his workbench. "Sit. Eat." Laura's eyes widened. "I can't. This is too much." "You asked for expired food. Consider this expired an hour ago. Now sit." She ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, trying to maintain composure but failing as each bite reminded her body what nourishment felt like. George pretended to organize tools, giving her privacy in the only way he knew how. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Laura," she whispered between bites. "I've been here 3 weeks. The refugee center is full. They say more ships are coming, but—" She trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging heavy. No one wanted more lichen refugees. George had seen the news feeds. The other species, the ones who considered themselves more advanced, had offered thoughts and concerns for the lichen people. The Avari donated money. The Grenth offered temporary shelter on one of their mining asteroids. The Mindari sent a strongly worded diplomatic letter to the Crethon Empire. Humans, though? Humans had sent warships. It was a small fleet, nothing that would win a war. But they'd parked themselves between the Crethon advance fleet and the refugee ships, buying time for evacuation. 37 human ships against 200 Crethon vessels. 29 ships never came back. The other species called it foolish, wasteful, emotionally illogical. Humans called it Tuesday. "You got any skills?" George asked, breaking his own reverie. Laura looked up, surprised. I was training as an engineer before everything happened. I can read hyperspace matrices, calibrate gravity dampeners, weld in 0G. She stopped, her tail curling around her legs defensively. "But I don't have certifications anymore. They were all stored on Fenris databases." George studied her for a long moment. His shop was small, barely profitable. Taking on an employee would be insane. She had no papers, no credentials, and the colony magistrate was already grumbling about refugee crime rates, even though statistics showed lichens committed fewer crimes than most species. "You start tomorrow," George said. 6 a.m. sharp. Pay is minimum wage until you prove yourself. Then we renegotiate. You know how to recalibrate a Mark 7 hyperdrive manifold? Laura's ears perked up, literally. Yes, the Cascade variant or the standard model. Cascade. 45-degree offset on the tertiary coils, resonance frequency adjusted to 7.2 terahertz, and you have to manually balance the... You're hired! For the first time since entering the shop, Laura smiled. It transformed her face, made her look less like a desperate refugee and more like the young woman she should have been. Over the following months, George's shop transformed. Laura worked harder than any 3 employees combined, arriving early and staying late. She had an intuitive understanding of machinery that George, for all his experience, had to admit surpassed his own. Word spread. Ships that once bypassed his humble shop started landing specifically for repairs. But it wasn't just business that changed. Laura taught George the old lichen songs, the ones sung on Fenris during the long winters. George taught Laura how to swear properly in 15 different languages, essential vocabulary for any mechanic. She learned to drink coffee so strong it could strip paint. He learned that lichens had an almost supernatural ability to detect faulty components by sound alone. When the colony magistrate came around asking questions about his unauthorized employee, George had papers ready, legal work permits he'd called in every favor to acquire. When xenophobic thugs spray-painted slurs on the shop's exterior, Laura arrived the next morning to find George already repainting, a baseball bat leaning against the wall nearby. "Humans are weird," Laura said one evening as they closed up shop together. "The Avari think you're primitive, the Grenth call you impulsive, the Mindari say you're emotionally unstable." George shrugged, locking the cash register. "Maybe we are." "But you're the only ones who helped," Laura continued, her voice thick with emotion. "When my world burned, you didn't send money or letters. You sent your sons and daughters to die for people you'd never met." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's an old human saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Maybe we're primitive, impulsive, and unstable, but we're also too damn stubborn to watch people suffer when we can do something about it." Laura's tail wagged slightly, a lichen sign of deep contentment. "Thank you, George, for everything." "Thank you for asking about expired sandwiches," George replied gruffly. "Best business decision I ever made." As they walked out together into the neon-lit streets, George reflected on how one question from a desperate refugee had changed everything. His shop was thriving. He had a friend, maybe even the daughter he'd never had. And somewhere out there, other humans were making similar choices, taking in the strays, fighting the fights, standing up when it would be easier to look away. The galaxy called humans primitive. Humans called it being human. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.